name's Courtney Gilbert, and I am Curator of Visual Arts at Sun Valley Museum of Art. And the exhibition that we opened last week is called 2 Years Supply. 2 Years Supply features artwork by 3 artists who all have deep family connections to southern Idaho. And the exhibition is really an examination of the history of agricultural settlement in southern Idaho, the communities that emerged out of that history, and how rural towns and cities in that part of our state are changing today. In a lot of ways, the kind of historical core of this exhibition is in the work of Alexis Pike. Pike is a 6th-generation Idahoan. She was born in Idaho Falls. She is connected through her family history to a woman named Annie Pike Greenwood. Greenwood was born into a kind of well-to-do family in Provo, Utah at the end of the 19th century, and wound up marrying a man who wanted to make a life as a farmer, who brought her and what were then their 2 young children to the town of Hazleton, Idaho. The reason that the Greenwoods wound up settling in Hazleton was that in 1894, the US government passed the Carey Act, which gave huge amounts of land to states in the American West on the condition that they get that land irrigated and farmers settled on it. And one of the underlying themes of this exhibition is that, of course, that land was not really the US government's to give away. It was land that had been occupied by the Shoshone-Bannock, in the case of southern Idaho, for generations. After the land was irrigated, water companies sought to bring farmers from the east and settle them on that land, and they lured them with very inexpensive land prices and also advertisements that portrayed southern Idaho as one of the ads said, perfect irrigation, never failing crops, a place where the wind didn't blow and the soil was rich. Greenwood wound up, after her family lost their farm and her marriage fell apart, she wrote a book called We Sagebrush Folks that is about both the challenges and the joys that she experienced farming in southern Idaho. So Alexis Pike, just about 100 years after her ancestor arrived in Hazleton, decided to look at that place now and how it's changed through time. So she's made a whole body of photographs that document life in some of the small towns in southern Idaho. There's a nice balance in her photographs between a story of decay through time. So for instance, she's photographed the interior of the one-room schoolhouse where Greenwood taught, which now is abandoned. She photographed houses going through foreclosure, houses that have been abandoned, but also the people who continue to make these communities whole. There's a photograph of a farmer resting on his spade that, it's very contemporary, but it could have been made 100 years ago. A photograph of 3 children sitting in the back of a pickup truck, smiling and laughing on the Fort Hall Shoshone-Bannock Reservation. The artist whose work was really the genesis for this project is Rebecca Campbell. And Campbell grew up in Salt Lake City. She's the daughter of 2 people who were born and raised on potato farms outside of Rupert, Idaho. And around 2012, 2013, she decided to make an entire body of work that really reflected back on her family history. And she titled it The Potato Eaters. She was inspired by the very famous Vincent van Gogh painting of the same name, and in particular by a letter that Van Gogh wrote about that painting, in which he described his desire to paint people eating food that they had grown, people who had a real connection to the land that they lived on. So she took her parents on a road trip together. They went back to the sites and towns that had been important in her parents' lives. She went through old family photographs, and she's made 2 very different bodies of paintings. There are a number that have a kind of black and white, almost sepia quality to them that were inspired by family photographs. So there's an enormous painting of her father standing in front of the door of the house he grew up in on the day he left for his church mission. There are paintings of aunts and an uncle coming back from a successful day of fishing. There is a portrait of her great-uncle Ralph, who was shot down as an Air Force pilot during World War II. There are a number of paintings made with a much brighter, more colorful palette that were based on places she visited with her mother and father. So the car dealership in Rupert, Idaho, Rupert Junction. There's a gorgeous kind of abstract but really sort of evocative painting called Dry Grass. And In addition to these paintings, the project includes 3 sculptures and installation pieces that are not just about her family's history, but also about a dialogue with major figures in art history. Rebecca created a sculpture called 2 Year Supply, full, that consists of more than 200 jars of peaches that she herself canned in 2013. And she's presented them in this beautiful cube that really recalls the minimalist sculptures of artists like Donald Judd made in the 1960s. So like Judd, she's working with kind of industrial materials in these jars, but she's filling them with the contents of her own hand labor, and labor that's really been historically associated with the work of women. As she said, in a lot of ways, each of her pieces is both a critique and an homage. The title, 2 Year Supply, comes from the Church of Latter-day Saints tradition of encouraging families to have a 2-year supply of food in case of emergency. The second installation that we have by Campbell is called 2 Year Supply Saved. It's a pile of sculptures of potatoes rubbed with graphite. The walls are rubbed with graphite. The floor is covered with glitter, and there's a mirror behind the potatoes. So you have this effect of doubling. There's a doubling of space, a doubling of the amount of materials in the space. And for Rebecca too, that piece it's about, the material that her family grew, the potato. It's about the idea of accumulation and preparation and saving. The rainbow is a reference to the idea that we all expect to find a pot of gold at the end of the rainbow, but maybe the real gold we're looking for isn't necessarily monetary or metal, it's family. And this piece too is a conversation with art history. In a lot of ways, a dialogue with the artist Robert Smithson. Smithson is best known for the spiral jetty, a huge earthwork in the Great Salt Lake. But he also created a series of sculptures that he called non-sites and consisted of fragments of mirrors, piles of dirt, piles of rocks. And in creating those sculptures, he often played with people's perception of space. So by using potatoes, this organic material, and glitter, she's making, in a lot of ways, a feminist critique of Smithson's work. The third installation that Rebecca Campbell created, 2 Year Supply Clean. And 2 Year Supply Clean consists of 8 shelves lined with glass mason jars full of different dilutions of Windex. So it's this beautiful spectrum of all these different blues. And on top of the sculptural installation is a projection that Campbell created that alternates between an image of a close-up of an eye opening and closing and of tangles of Christmas lights going on and off. She made that piece largely about her mother and her mother's use of cleaning as a way of kind of maintaining her own mental health. For Campbell's mother, cleaning was something that was both satisfying and gave her a sense of purpose, but an obsession. For Rebecca, there's a parallel to her own love of Christmas, as she says. For her, Christmas is that same thing. There's a fine line between the joy it gives her and too much, the obsession. And the Windex is symbolic of that idea. It's so beautiful in color, but it's toxic, right? The third artist in the exhibition is a photographer named Steve Davis. Davis grew up in American Falls, Idaho. He left American Falls after high school, went on to establish a career as a really successful photographer in the Pacific Northwest, but would occasionally go back and visit. And as he made these visits, he noticed how much the city was changing and also the surrounding landscape. When he was growing up there was the kind of small town farming community, and he noticed more and more of these family farms were being purchased by international conglomerates. He made a whole body of work called As American Falls that offers a really interesting, I think, glimpse into life in that town now. He has a beautiful photograph of a Shoshone-Bannock woman riding a horse down a street in town. And just like Alexis Pike, I think it's important for him to acknowledge that the native peoples who lived on that land before the Carey Act still have a thriving community in the region. As Davis has said, even though many people now leave town after they graduate from high school and go on to live elsewhere, People there are still, having children, going to church, going to bars, crowning homecoming queens, and life goes on. It's just different. So one of the things I discovered while I was doing research for this project is that many of the Japanese Americans who were interned at the Minidoka internment camp in southern Idaho during World War II were actually sent out to work on regional farms and paid almost nothing. Their labor was essentially confiscated in order to keep these farms running, while the men who owned them, many of them were off, fighting the war. And interestingly, one of the photographers associated with the Farm Services Administration project, which sent people like Dorothea Lange out into rural America during the Great Depression to document the hardships people were facing, Lee was sent to Minidoka, and he photographed both the camp itself, but also men working in the fields on farms in the area. And what's interesting about these photographs for me is that Russell Lee takes a really strangely idealized approach to the camp. I hope everyone will come in and take a look at the exhibition to consider a portion of our state's history in a new way, and also to look at how agricultural life in Idaho has and has not changed over the last 100 years.